Recording has started.
Cool. All right. So we'll get into some of the greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. The way we think about decarbonization strategies in sort of three different tiers. The first is related to building decarbonization. So how do we first reduce the emissions associated with our buildings? And those come in generally two forms. And the first is efficiency. How do we reduce building demands through operational expenditures, capital expenditures, and general conservation efforts? The second is around electrification. So how can we eliminate scope 1 emissions, that natural gas, generally through capital expenditure projects, and prepare for future renewable grids? So the first tier of decarbonization strategies is really focusing on what you have control over. The second tier or group of strategies is around renewable energy. So how can you first provide on-site solar plus storage? This generally has a positive return on investment and increases the renewable energy supply. And then the third is like off-site or virtual PPAs. So this is an opportunity to reduce cost and support new renewables. And as we're looking at renewable energy systems that are off-site, not located on the site, the term additionality becomes increasingly important. And what that means is the project that you're investing in or the renewable energy credits that you are buying add additional solar to the grid. Typical renewable energy credits are from an existing solar system. So when looking to renewable energy, if the project that you are funding or financing adds additional solar to the grid, that has a significantly larger positive impact towards climate change compared to buying an existing project. And the third is carbon offsets. So those come in different forms, including carbon offsets, credits, green power. Generally has no return on investment where you're paying to offset your emission. The CO2 is still being emitted at your site, but it's a way of offsetting the emissions associated with your building. And these are sort of the lowest tier of of strategies. So as we're looking at how to frame and create a hierarchy, the first priority is building decarbonization. The second is around renewable energy, and the third is around carbon offsets. And looking at those categories of projects. So first on the building decarbonization and renewables, we want to understand how do these different strategies actually impact climate. And the first is neutralizing a firm's impact. So building decarbonization and renewables have a very high impact. We're actually reducing the emissions associated with our buildings compared to carbon avoidance or removal credits have a less impact. And if we look at sort of the next two of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets, as well as mitigating climates, direct projects around building decarbonization and renewables have the highest impact in terms of mitigating our risk. Whereas carbon avoidance credits are less. So as we're looking at how our carbon neutrality strategy actually impacts climate change, having those direct projects is increasingly important, as well as when we're looking at the business model where direct projects have the opportunity to have a return on investment versus credits are a expense to an organization, whether a university or a portfolio. So generally has less of an impact as well as a less of a return. If we break that down a little bit further, if we're looking at that financial impact, if we're looking at the first cost, generally those first projects, tier projects with efficiency, electrification, and renewables has the highest cost. However, it has the opportunity for payback as well as operating cost and has that highest climate impact. And that's really where focusing on the first costs and how do we generate financing that helps support those projects is going to be critical. Electrification projects can be difficult depending on the utility and the utility rates. If in a region that has high electricity rates, low gas costs. And we'll get to that a little bit more about how efficiency and electrification can be paired together at a site in order to provide economics that are more favorable for a project. Pause in there and just see if there's any questions or thoughts or areas to dig a little bit deeper on.
I haven't received any questions in the chat, but if anybody has a question, they can unmute or Write it in the chat.
All right, well, we can keep going. So now that we've sort of gone over some of the policy and market trends, the reason why we're looking at decarbonization, what are the different strategies? Want to dig into the California State University's decarbonization framework. This was a project that we worked on with the California State University Systems Chancellor's Office, which provided different resources, guidelines, tools for the 23 universities. Real quick, a little bit of an overview about the CSU system. California CSU has 23 campuses and they're the largest public university in the country. They, at a given time, educate 486,000 students and have over 3.9 million living alumni. As you can see, their campuses are located throughout the state in a variety of different climate zones. And they are consistently a high ranking for upward social and economic mobility, and that is a core um, of the California State University is to provide that opportunity. So having economically viable and financially viable system that really promotes that and keeps tuition low is critical, which we'll get into as far as how that influenced their decarbonization approach. And a little bit about their facilities. They have over 95 million square feet across the 23 campuses, which includes over 20,000 buildings. And on average, those buildings are over 33 years old. So it's a very old building stock. They're continuing to grow. Humboldt State will be the third polytechnic university. Um, and their central utility plants are a wide range throughout the campuses, including some steam, centralized heating on water, or distributed. So as the CSU system was looking at developing a framework to approach their decarbonization of all 23 of these campuses, it was really important for that to meet and be applicable to a wide range of campuses, building types, as well as climate zones. And this is a framework that we've been using in other campuses, other institutions to understand emissions and how to prioritize projects. So a little bit about their emissions. CSU, following the state target, is committed to reducing emissions by 80% by 2040 compared to a 1990 baseline. And this shows their emissions over time from 1990 to 2015. And you can see there's actually been a slight reduction in emissions, and the majority of that is from electricity. That's from investing in energy efficiency projects as well as the natural reduction of grid emissions. And you can see down here in red the amount of emissions associated with natural gas and cogeneration. So in order for CSU to meet their 2040 target, they need to be carbon neutral with electricity and see around a 60% reduction in natural gas. I think this type of reduction is typically what we see across most portfolios, as well as other university campuses, where natural gas is really the biggest challenge. Um, so if we look towards 2040 and that target, we can see Senate Bill 100, which will provide carbon-free power by 2045. Will take out a significant portion of those electricity emissions. However, there still presents to be a significant gap in order to meet their target. And that gap, as you can see from this breakdown, has to come from natural gas. So the focus of the CSU decarbonization framework was really of how do we address our scope 1 emissions? How do we do that cost effectively in order to meet our 2040 as well as other campuses' carbon neutrality targets before that date? So some of the project goals is first to empower and reorient energy managers, facility officers to always include decarbonization options when they're looking at deferred maintenance, capital projects, and really change the culture of their facilities groups in order to prioritize decarbonization. The next is cost-effective strategies. So how do they do that within a state institution, as well as fit within their current funding and financing mechanisms? How do they have maintainable technologies and solutions? And how is this applicable? Um, how is this framework applicable to reduce risk of stranded assets, be adaptable to a diverse set of campuses, as well as encourage proactivity within the facilities management? So I'm not going to go into the details of every aspect of it, but the framework was sort of divided into three categories. The first was resources with policy review, technology reviews, and conceptual design. The next around guidelines, and the third around tools. All of this information is available at this link below. Definitely would recommend going to the CSU system. So all of the resources that are provided are available for everyone to take a look at and use, including the lifecycle cost analysis Excel tool. The way that framework was structured was creating a long-term roadmap for CSU systems to start thinking about decarbonization. And the first part of that process was during the assessment and planning. So how do you establish a campus vision? How do you understand the existing conditions? What data do you need to collect? How do you look at your central plants, which typically use 50 to 60% of natural gas on a campus? And how do you create a plan? So that assessment and planning phase is critical in order for understanding for a campus or a portfolio to understand, what are their goals long term and what actions do they need to take. The next is on load reduction. So that's how do you reset hot water temperatures to make electrification viable in the future. This is something that all buildings can do now. They can investigate their heating hot water temperatures, understand how they can reset it, even if they're not planning to reduce or electrify right now. Scheduling, building optimization, and controls of how do you reduce just generally loads on the campus? What are the near-term electrification projects that you can pursue? How do you optimize that, and how do you plan for that long term? All while doing continuous improvements around retrofits, controls, upgrades, hot water coil replacements, phase out, and measurement and verification. So this structure of that assessment and planning really lays the groundwork for those future load reductions, electrification, and improvements across campus. I am going to pause again there and just see if there's any questions before going into some of the key takeaways and strategies that wanted to share with everyone today.
Hey, Brian, I haven't received.
Oh,
go ahead, please.
Yep, I was just searching for that life cycle assessment tool for the CSUs.
If you
Can you drop that in the chat, Brian?
I was just going to do that.
Thank you.
That was my question as well, so glad you asked.
Thank you for that. There is the link. Cool. Any other slide or questions? Great. We'll keep going. So one of the first strategies within CSU was first developing the familiarity with new technology. So within the technology review, there's cheat sheets around different electrified heating systems. What is the cost generally, high, medium, low? What's the efficiency of that? What are some of the design considerations, best applications, and additional operational considerations, as well as more detailed information about specific systems. The first is, need to understand, this is a new technology. How do you apply it and reduce any concerns? So I think that educational aspect in developing familiarity is important within any institution, where often people are used to and comfortable with natural gas systems. The next is to establish climate adaptive design standards. So this shows the heating and cooling degree days within Long Beach, California. So heating degree days are the amount of is a representation of how much heating is required and how much cooling is required. You can see looking across different weather files. If you look at Title 24 or TMY3, which was weather from 1960 to 1990, Long Beach was actually a heating dominated climate with limited cooling. If we move towards like the actual weather data from 2015 to 2019, you can see there's actually a shift where Long Beach became a more cooling dominated climate with a 200% increase and a 50% reduction in heating. What that means for when we're looking at projects is really like understanding, this trend is going to continue. So we need to be designing buildings with that future state in mind. The next key takeaway was incorporating carbon within infrastructure planning. And what's key to that is avoiding investments in future stranded assets. In order to do that, it's important to understand what the existing infrastructure is, and then how do we inventory natural gas equipment, and how do we plan ahead for equipment failure? So when a rooftop unit that uses gas fails, we understand what the alternative heat pump system is, and we are able to be proactive in replacing that. I think one of the challenges around the CSU system, or really any facility, is when their equipment fails. Often that's an emergency. You need to act fast, and that often results in just providing a like-for-like replacement. By being proactive and having inventories, having at least plans or ideas of how to approach projects ahead of time helps with that long-term phase transition. That also can help with campus standards. So having standards around no new natural gas assets, as well as for new buildings and major retrofits. So how can you use those capital projects on campus to both decarbonize that building as well as others? We've seen some interesting applications of that where buildings will provide a heat recovery chiller that pulls heat off chilled water returned from the campus in order to supply heating for that building as well as others within the region or within that area of the campus. So there's a lot of opportunities if you start thinking about how are you going to do that long-term phase transition and how can you incorporate that within existing capital projects. The next was to establish a heating decarbonization hierarchy. So how to think about if we want to decarbonize, we want to electrify a large heating and hot water system, how do we approach that? So this hierarchy is the way we think about how to reduce those emissions. And the first is what's core is improving building efficiency. So how do renovations, retrofits, controls upgrades, retro commissioning, reducing loads for heating is going to be the most important first step. Next, we want to look at maximizing heat recovery. So how can we recapture heat from the building, whether through chilled water, having thermal energy storage tanks. Heat recovery is the most efficient way to produce hot water. So maximizing that will reduce the electricity use and really the overall efficiency of that system. The next is how do we then optimize those systems? So how do we add controls? There's also opportunities for false cooling on air handlers or domestic hot water storage or hot water coil replacements before looking at that additional heating sources, which is sort of that last tier. We found across most of the CSU campuses at their central plants, the first three of load reductions, heat recovery, and optimization can provide generally between 70 to 90% of the heat on the campus that's required. That last 10 to 30% is really looking at those additional heating sources, which may be ground source heat pumps, air to water heat pumps, electric boilers. I think what's important is we don't need to focus on that 100% immediately. Like let's focus on reducing that 60, 70% today, where it's extremely cost effective, and then planning for that last 10 to 30%. And establishing this type of hierarchy on a campus, identifying the specific projects, understanding, when can you add a heat recovery chiller or thermal energy storage helps to change the mentality of then, we only need that additional 10 to 30%, not the entire 100. Also, right sizing equipment. This shows the heating load profile of a typical CSU campus. You can see this plant was sized or designed for 13,500 kBTU and peaks around 12,000. However, the vast majority of the time, it's operating in the 10 to 15, 20% of that overall capacity. If we're able to provide heating sources that are electric, that don't use natural gas at around 25% of that plant capacity, we can save 75% of the natural gas. So it's really important when we're looking at immediate projects, it's how do we reduce and right size equipment and how do we implement those high impact projects early? Climate change is not based on annual emissions, it's the cumulative. So the more we can do to act immediately and find these early wins, the more impactful for the university or portfolio.
Brian, could we go back to that chart 1 second? The bottom of the chart with the legend identifying that it's hourly heating demand is cut off a little bit. Is there a way for you to, I'm seeing your controls instead of the bottom of the slide.
I am not sure how to hide that.
Okay,
Oh, there we go.
there you go. Thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you. So as we're looking at the CSU system, I think there's a lot of ways that any campus or portfolio of buildings can start looking at how they can provide this analytics in a more scalable fashion and be more effective. So the way we approach California State University across the 23 campuses and understanding the heat recovery potential is first by collecting data from all of those campuses through their energy information systems or their building automation system. We collected data from existing infrastructure reports as well as weather data from NOAA Weather Station and created a data lake which included processed, cleaned, and formatted data, which then we can provide modeling and planning tools. So by having all of this information feed into the same workflow, we're really able to be scalable and able to provide feedback on a much larger scale and much more efficiently. Um, For the CSU system, we developed a heat recovery tool. I think there's a lot of really great opportunities of how we can leverage different dashboarding technologies in order to display data and help to inform and understand information. So this shows the cooling and heating profile for a example CSU system. You can see the darker color represents the heat recovery potential. So how much heat can we pull from that campus or from the chilled water and produce hot water? So in this case, we can produce 72% of the heating demand on this campus just based on the chilled water demand. That means we can reduce 70% of natural gas. We can also drill into specific periods. So this shows in the winter how there are periods where we have excess heating where we would not be able to meet that with a heat recovery chiller. But there's also opportunities in the afternoons where we have excess cooling. So this shows, we can add thermal energy storage and increase that potential. Looking at different scenarios around thermal energy storage or false cooling. False cooling is a strategy where we reduce the amount of time that economizers work, and we can recapture heat through the chilled water system at the air handler. And that strategy alone will increase that heat recovery potential up to 83.2%. So we're able to, just through some simple optimization of existing infrastructure, increase the ability to recapture heat. Now, if we look at adding thermal energy storage, we can get that close to 90%. So there's a huge opportunity within California where we do have temperate climates where we are able to, take a significant chunk out of the heating within our buildings by looking at heat recovery, optimizing that, and adding thermal energy storage. And I think these type of dashboard tools are really important and helpful for communicating that to facility staff, to engineers, as well as us internally when we're working on a project so that we can understand how systems are operating. And if we look at the California State University system, if we're looking at just the central plant, we found that through adding thermal energy storage, through optimizing and heat recovery, we can reduce 82% of natural gas across the system, which would save 12.7 million therms and save 67,000 metric tons of emissions annually, and take a significant gap out of that, out of the CSU's emissions for their 2040 target. There's still a significant additional natural gas that would need to be addressed, but it does offer the opportunity to make a significant dent. And other policies, programs that CSU are looking at are, in addition, updating their sustainability policies in order to reflect their decarbonization framework, looking at other resiliency frameworks or other frameworks around resiliency and microgrids, integrating this within their utility master planning process as well as infrastructure projects, and also looking at other funding and financing opportunities. Want to provide one campus and how their roadmap from 2020 to their 2030 goal. I'm looking at CSU Long Beach. So first, looking at their building and capital projects. CSU Long Beach committed to carbon neutrality back in 2011. They did their first inventory in 2013, developed a climate action plan in 2014, And in 2017 to 2018, we worked with them on a strategic energy plan, which helped to guide future projects. In 2018, they had their first net zero energy building. In 2021, they opened a Living Building Challenge Pedal certified project for housing. And looking towards the future, they have additional capital projects. So they've changed the way they thought about capital projects and used that as an opportunity to meet their carbon action goals. Looking at their infrastructure and energy management, in 2016, they installed 4.7 megawatts of solar. They added 15 megawatt hours of battery storage in 2017. And in 2018, that clean energy roadmap developed a roadmap for projects throughout over the next 10 years, where they've developed a retro commissioning program. They're looking at deferred maintenance for electrifying the campus and really planning for taking the big chunk out of their emissions with a central utility plan. Having this plan up front helped to set this framework and change the way the facilities in the campus prioritize projects. I'm going to pause again right there and just see if there are any questions from anyone online.
Can you explain kind of what you mean by deferred maintenance and what the advantages are for that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think deferred maintenance is typically equipment that is either at its end of use expected useful life or beyond that. Often we see that equipment, especially within the university systems, is beyond the expected useful life. So if you're looking at a boiler within a building, you're going to need to replace it at some point. By understanding when that boiler will likely fail, understanding what are the potential for electrification, and instead of replacing with a like-for-like boiler replacement, let's look at how do we electrify that, or how do we provide a different system. So by aligning your electrification projects or opportunities across campus or building with the existing deferred maintenance schedules, it helps to reduce the cost, because it's just the delta of what is the cost of replacing this with a like-for-like system versus an electrified alternative.
Okay.
It can be very difficult of retiring equipment early. So that's why it's important to have that long-term plan and roadmap for deferred maintenance, and then understanding how to align your decarbonization goals or projects with that schedule.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Brian, we have received a couple questions in the chat. This is a twofold question on the same topic. Is the individual campus or the CSU Chancellor's Office responsible for meeting these goals and targets? And the second question related to it is, are these tools used by individual campus facility staff in order to justify capital projects to internal or CSU system decision makers?
Repeating that again, Kelly?
Oh, the question is the individual campus or the CSU Chancellor's Office responsible for meeting these goals and targets? And the second part of the question is, are these tools used by individual campus facility staff in order to justify capital projects to internal or CSU system decision makers?
Great. Yes, so the first question around the Chancellor's Office versus campuses is both. The Chancellor's Office is responsible for the overall emissions of the CSU system. Individual campuses have also made their own carbon neutrality commitments that go beyond the state requirements. So Long Beach, for example, has that 2030 carbon neutrality commitment. So it's sort of a combination of both the campuses as well as at the Chancellor's Office level. And the second question on using these resources is the resources that were developed, which I'll go back real quick to here, really can be used by both the internal facilities management facilities managers if they're wanting to understand technologies, energies managers, sustainability managers, AVPs, as well as consultants. There's a lot of information that could be used by anyone working within the CSU system or really any university. But ultimately, the projects that are on the ground are the responsibility of the university, and the Chancellor's Office provided this project as a resource in order to support those efforts.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have right now.
All right, I will keep going. So as we're looking at carbon neutral operations and long-term planning, the first is to understand different frameworks and how those frameworks can influence um, a plan or strategy. It's really important, I think, in order for credibility of using existing frameworks, the science-based targets being one of them, as a way of understanding how emissions over time can and should be targeted. The way we have approached net zero and carbon planning is in sort of 3 or 4 different phases. And the first is in measurement and planning. So determining, what are your goals? What are your key indicators? What are the different data sources? How do we collect and analyze that in order to make informed decisions about um, goals for a campus? The next is to assess strategies. So what are the different strategies that a campus or portfolio can look at between energy efficiency, retrocommissioning, electrification, standards, renewable energy, and carbon offsets? Then providing a scenario planning, so understanding, what are the costs of those? How does it align with procurement and capital expenditure planning? And how do we provide the financial modeling in order to develop action plans to guide the next 5 years? And then how do we develop a framework for monitoring those key performance indicators, understanding end of life equipment replacements, and aligning with those long-term strategies? And that's I think it's really important to understand, what are the different strategies we can employ, what makes sense, what are the timing of those generally speaking, and then how do we establish goals? So goals can be, percentage of buildings that have LED retrofits, or the amount of money that's going to be invested in energy efficiency. I mean, I think what we found most helpful with past projects that we've worked on is really just understanding what is the true cost. How much is this going to cost us? And once you have an understanding of that, it changes the conversation around, now that we know how much this costs, how are we going to pay for it? What are the different strategies? So I think it's helped to change the conversation um, around, not knowing what to do to really having a good idea of what you need to do. And then it's how to pay for it. Um, if we look at a typical building in those categories, the first is around energy efficiency. So typically LED lighting, HVAC retrofits. How do you then optimize that around retro commissioning and controls upgrades? How do you electrify, generally boilers and water heaters? How do you look at standards, whether those are green leases, building standards, or other requirements? And then finally, how do you look at renewable energy or carbon offsets to offset the total emissions? And this general framework is how we've been approaching and thinking about for a typical building. And when we're looking at capital expenditures, we want to reassess our existing capital expenditure plans. We want to identify which projects have energy implications, and then understand the infrastructure and identify end of useful life for high carbon intensive equipment. This will help ready buildings for those net zero carbon operations, reviewing building standards, implementing those green leases or standards, and then long-term electrifying equipment and looking at renewable energy and carbon offsets. And by aligning capital expenditure planning with climate commitments, really helps to find capital in order to pay for those projects that really do drive emissions reductions. I won't go through all this, but just as an example of how you can start thinking about capital projects and how to align those. So for example, on a boiler, if your boiler, needs to be replaced in the next 3 to 5 years, we want to know what is the actual existing peak heating load. The business as usual approach would be replacing with a like for like replacement. The net zero approach would be looking at like a heat recovery chiller. So by knowing this boiler needs to be replaced in the next 3 to 5 years, we should be thinking now about what is the feasibility of adding this heat recovery chiller, what size chiller, so that when we get to that point, we can look at, instead of just doing a like for like replacement, being proactive and going with a strategy that helps to reduce emissions. And looking across a portfolio or a campus, there's a huge opportunity looking at either just heating and cooling demands, as well as energy efficiency, of pulling information across portfolios of buildings into a centralized database and then running energy and financial models off of that. So that helps to scale and ultimately reduce the cost us as consultants when we're working with our clients and allow them to make more informed decisions within a shorter period of time and generally less costly. And there's a lot of opportunities of leveraging dashboarding and other data visualization tools to help support those decision making. So as we're looking at the overall planning approach, sort of the three key strategies or three strategies to look at, I think one is on portfolio electrification. So understanding historical demands, identifying those high impact projects, and then providing conceptual recommendations to inform future deferred maintenance. The next is net zero planning. So how do we identify opportunities leveraging existing data? I think a lot of facilities have a ton of information around facility condition assessments, previous audits, other infrastructure reports that can be leveraged in order to make informed decisions without having to do extensive energy audits. Then how do you align projects with deferred maintenance? How do we understand funding and financing mechanisms? And then how do we reinvest savings to further decarbonization efforts? And the third could be looking at ESCOs. And this isn't something that recommend across, but in general, I think funding and financing are challenging, and that is a strategy or other third-party financing for larger capital projects. As we're looking at a general approach to funding for energy and decarbonization projects across university campuses or institutional clients, the first is really an internal operation and maintenance budgets. So that is deferred maintenance, if there's an additional annual energy budget for projects. Typically, those projects are used to finance LED lighting, HVAC retrofits, water heaters, retro commissionings, really cost-effective strategies. Those cost-effective strategies, with a green revolving fund or a mechanism to understand savings and reinvest, help to support additional projects. The next is more internal capital funding. So within the CSU system, this can be larger building renovations, new construction projects, and generally come from the general budget, state and fund, or bonds. So these are usually larger infrastructure projects. Some of these are not as cost effective when we're looking at large steam to heating hot water conversions or central utility plants, depending on the existing infrastructure. And then the third bucket that we look at is external funding sources, such as on-bill financing, ESCOs, P3. And those, again, can be a combination of those high impact projects as well as other larger capital projects. And I think looking at external funding sources is something that a lot of institutional clients are starting to consider more seriously, just given the amount of work that needs to be done in order to meet goals. So I'm going to jump to a summary just to sort of close things out of some key considerations that I think are helpful to walk away from. And the first is policy and risk. It's really important to understand the impact of risks, how to mitigate that from local, state, and federal policies. With energy efficiency, how do you invest in energy efficiency that have higher ROI, larger impact on net zero carbon than offsets? These should be prioritized first. The second, with renewable energy, procuring renewable energy and reducing scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, really understanding the additionality, aligning with science-based targets or other established frameworks, and really looking at near and long-term planning as a way of reassessing the way capital expenditure plans are developed within an organization. There and see if anyone has any questions. All right. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join, and certainly can follow up with a copy of the presentation, and feel free to reach out if there's any questions you have, or happy to take the time to talk in the future.
Great. Kelly and Brian, thank you so much for this. We really appreciate it. This was very informative and educational. I know I learned a bunch, and I think everyone else did too. We look forward to it. So when you get the recording, we'll put it up on our website next week. So there's multiple places it can be shown and seen and stuff like that. So really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.